Here we go. All right. Good morning, Jane.
Good morning, John. Thank you for doing this.
You're welcome. I'm standing in here for Gary, and Gary would like to ask you your history as a sociological social psychologist, which might include, let's start with your graduate school training.
Okay. I think I'm going to start before my graduate school training because being a woman who came into academics before the women's movement, I would like to say a few words about that.
All right.
I went to college thinking that, well, maybe I would have a career as a social worker, but probably, stopped doing that when I got married and had kids. I was in high school and college in the 1950s, and that was sort of what women expected to do. And I owe my career to a social psychology professor at the University of Rochester named Vincent Nolis, who nagged me until I decided to go to graduate school. And he said that I should go to either Harvard or Stanford. And I went to Stanford and worked with Leon Festinger. So, as you can see, I am not trained as a sociological social psychologist. I'm trained as a psychological social psychologist. And I ended up in sociology by a very circuitous route. But my graduate training, as I said, was with Leon Festinger at Stanford, the heyday of dissonance theory. So I was mainly trained in experimental social psychology. I never knew anything about sociological theory, only psychological theory. I never knew how to do a survey. I did do a little bit of field work, but I was never trained sociologically. I also only had a job in a psychology department for 4 of the years of my career. The rest of the time, I was either in a survey research center or in a home economics department or in the sociology department at the University of Wisconsin.
Okay. And sort of the follow-on to that is what do you see as the role of social psychology at Wisconsin? I assume that means basically in the sociology department of Wisconsin, although you did spend some time in another school before you came over and joined us.
Right, but there wasn't any social psychology there until I came there, and I had to invent a course in order to teach social psychology. That was in the in the early 70s, and of course by then the women's movement was well underway, and students were clamoring for courses on gender. And in the School of Family Resources and Consumer Sciences, which is what it technically was called, there were no such courses. And I couldn't teach any of the courses that were on their books because I knew nothing about children and I knew nothing about families, and it was the Child and Family Studies department. So I invented a course called Sex Differences, Sex Roles, and Society, which essentially ran all the way from biology to macro sociology, but the core of it was social psychology and roles and interpersonal interactions and so on. The first time I taught that course, which was probably 1972 or 73, they had put us in a room that held 50 people, and when I got to it, they had not controlled the numbers, and there were 200 people milling around in the corridor. So at least I knew I had something I could probably keep teaching for a while. Okay. In this sociology department, social psychology has been traditionally strong, due, I am sure, to the long influence of William Sewell. But when I got into this department, by a very lucky fluke, I joined a strong group of social psychologists, and I ended up teaching both the undergraduate course and one of the 2 core graduate courses repeatedly for I have no idea now how many years. John DeLamater, who was doing this interview, and I have worked together for, what is it now, John, 30 years?
30 years, maybe.
Yes, right. Because he is the other core member. He's the one core member who remains. The department has been unable to replace social psychologists in the way that they would have liked to. How many would you say there are now, John?
3 or 4, depending on how you count.
Right.
And we had, I think, about 8 when you joined us, and
right.
it just kind of slowly, as people left or retired and weren't replaced, it's kind of slowly dwindled.
Right.
So,
which I think is too bad, but...
So do I.
Yes. Okay. So what else do we want to talk about?
All right. Next question. Talk about the substantive concerns of your career. What topic did you choose to work on and why? Mm-hmm. First of all, and then there's some follow-ups to that.
Okay, well, we'll get to the follow-ups. My first job out of graduate school, I was hired onto a project on adolescent anti-Semitism. So my first book is on that, but that was not something I chose. At the time, I was married to someone who said he was never going to leave the Bay Area, and true to his word, he never has. He still lives there. When I went to the University of Pennsylvania in 1967, I very briefly toyed with some work on jealousy, which went absolutely nowhere. My late husband, my third and final husband, and I began a research project on emergency intervention because he had gone for a year, what I called his postdoc, working with Bib Latané at Columbia University, and at that time they're the ones that started the whole experimental tradition on intervention in emergencies. And being a social worker and being concerned with things in the real world, he was very unhappy with the way they were studying this because it was all very laboratory and he wasn't at all convinced that it was going to translate to the real world. So he was riding the subway one day and a drunk fell off the bench and was rolling around on the floor, and he looked around and nobody was doing anything. They were all burying their faces in their newspapers. And finally, being a social worker, he got up and picked the guy up and sat him on the bench and made sure he was okay. And he was on his way down to Philadelphia, where I was, to spend the weekend. And by the time he got to Philadelphia, he had designed our first subway study, which essentially involved a man with a cane and a drunk collapsing in the subway, and 4 people serving as observers, and 1 serving as a model, who only got to serve as a model with the drunk because people picked up the guy with the cane so fast that he never got the chance to act. Anyway, so that was our first study. That was published in 1969. We did 2 other studies in the subway. Irv was instrumental in developing a theory at that point that I continued on with later. My late husband always got very bored with things and wanted to move on, and he didn't see that this was going to get any more practical than it already was, and therefore he decided to start doing other more practical things. And about mid-70s, I asked another 2 social psychologists who were by then doing research in this area if they would like to write a book with me. And they both said yes. Sam Gertner said yes conditionally, and the condition was that I had to take on his graduate student, John DeVideo. And so it was a 4-authored book. Sam Gertner, me, Jack DeVideo, Sam Gertner, and Russell Clark. And that came out in 1981 with the title of Emergency Intervention. Since then, I have consistently worked on altruism and helping behavior in various different forms. Obviously, I got into it by the fact that my husband had this idea, but I continued on with it because it just felt right, and this seemed to me like what I wanted to spend the rest of my career doing. After the emergency intervention book, well, actually while we were writing the emergency intervention book, one day I was brushing my teeth, and there is a theory in social psychology that says that confronting yourself in a mirror makes you self-reflective. And I did start reflecting on, all of a sudden you've been giving blood. By now you've given a gallon of blood. I wonder how that happened. And then, because I'm a social scientist, I thought, I wonder why anybody would give a gallon of blood or more. And so I decided that my next project in the altruism and helping area would be on blood donors and how people got to be regular blood donors. And I started by giving questionnaires out, just leaving them. Well, no, first I started by interviewing nurses at the campus blood donation center. University of Wisconsin, I think, is the only university that at that time had a campus blood donation center. So I interviewed nurses. I had them give me names of students who had given at least 4 times that they knew from their records. I interviewed them. I sat around and watched the process. It's where I had been giving blood myself, so in a sense I had been doing participant observation there. And then the first thing I did after that was to make up a questionnaire for pre-donation and another one for post-donation. It had a lot of issues about emotions and how they felt, because it was clear to me from both the donors and the nurses that emotion played an important part in blood donation. Over the years, I did this, studied them for quite a while, and then I branched out and studied regular donors, not only in other parts of Madison and Milwaukee, but around the country. I had a dissertation done with me by Peter Colero, in which he introduced the concept of role identity, and eventually he and I wrote a book on blood donors. I've been doing a lot of, after that I became a favorite of the blood industry and was on a bunch of committees that, looking into regulations in the blood industry and so on. The last time, in fact, I gave a talk to a blood organization was last summer in Milwaukee. So I'm still, as I say to people, it's a small pond, the study of blood donation, but I am the frog.
If not the biggest fish.
No, I'm just the frog in the pond. Okay.
So one of the questions here is,
yes.
Speaking of being self-reflective, what do you see as the most important contributions that you've